A gray morning in Mifflin County, Pennsylvania, and Rachel Hausman is backing a rusted flatbed trailer up to the loading door of the little bark tannery on Cutler Road. The door rolls open. Out comes the smell first, wet and sharp. Then the pile itself, hide trimmings and split scrap and pale shavings, sliding off a forklift into her trailer. She wears her husband's work gloves. She does not cover her nose. For 11 years, this tannery paid a hauler to run that same pile to the landfill, dollars every week to make it disappear. And now a widow in her early 30s is taking the whole stinking load home. For nothing. Across the fence, two men stand watching. One of them laughs, turns his head, and spits into the weeds. Down at the feed store, they already have a name for her. Trash Lady. By spring, the heap behind her barn will grow into something the whole road can smell, and the county will call it an illegal dump and send a man with an order and 30 days.
But behind that same barn, on 42 acres everyone swore were cropped to death, something is about to come up green and heavy, where nothing should grow at all. And something else will be hanging in her workshop that makes the men who laughed go quiet. What can a dying farm possibly do with a truckload of what a tannery throws away? But to understand what she saw in that pile, you have to go back. Back to 2014, to a ledger of soil notes and the man she buried. If you have ever been told your idea was worthless, this story is for you. Subscribe and tell us where you are watching from. The winter of 2014 was mild in central Pennsylvania, the ground half frozen and gray under a sky that never quite cleared. Rachel Hausman sat at the kitchen table of the farm on Cutler Road with a coffee gone cold and a bank letter she had read 4 times. Her husband, Daniel Hausman, had been dead 11 weeks. He had worked 42 acres of tomato ground until the ground quit on him, the yields dropping year after year, the soil packed pale and lifeless where the same crop had run too long. Now the payments were hers, and the dirt was hers, and neither one was worth much. On the table beside the letter lay a ledger, black cloth cover worn soft at the corners, kept by Daniel's father, Elias Hausman, across 53 seasons. She turned the pages slowly. Rows of dates, rainfall, seed depth, and in the margins the old man's small remarks. One line she read twice. Ground gives back what you feed it. Feed it nothing, and it stops. Under it, Elias had written a number, the organic matter in the north field, 2%. And then a single word. Starving. Rachel pressed her thumb against that word. Outside, the empty tomato beds lay black and cracked, drained of everything green things need. She had no money for the bagged fertilizer the co-op sold, $40 a bag, and she counted 12 beds. She closed the ledger and looked a long time at nothing. Somewhere down the road, the little tannery ran its bark vats through the cold, and every week a hauler carried its trimmings off to the landfill. She did not know that yet. But the word on the page had already lodged in her. Starving. She wrote it on the back of the bank letter and underlined it once. An April afternoon in 2015. And Rachel Hausman stood inside the little bark tannery on Cutler Road with her hat in her hands. The owner, Curtis Yoder, wiped his palms on his apron and looked at her like she had asked to buy his teeth. She told him she wanted the trimmings, all of it, every week. He said the hauler cost him better than $60 a load, and he would gladly hand her the whole mess for nothing. Then he asked why. She only tapped the ledger under her arm and said she had her reasons.
Curtis rubbed the back of his neck and said nobody had ever backed a trailer up for it before. The first load rode home wet and heavy behind her flatbed, pale shavings and split scrap dripping down the road. By June, the heap behind the barn had turned, and the smell reached the fence line, then the mailboxes, then the feed store. That was where it found her. She was counting out seed money at the counter when Wendell Frey, the co-op man, leaned on the register and grinned. "How is the perfume farm, Rachel?" Across from him stood Marlin Stutzman, who milked 80 heads straight across the road from her place. He laughed into his cap. "Trash lady hauling home what a decent man pays to bury." Rachel set her coins down one at a time. She did not raise her voice. She said the ground would tell them who was right, and picked up her receipt. Then, that same evening, she walked out to the reeking pile with a bucket, a trowel, and the ledger open to a blank page, and reached in. A May morning in 2015, and Rachel Hausman knelt at the head of the first tomato bed with a wheelbarrow of pale shavings still wet from the pile. She had waited a month, the ledger open on the barn shelf, to Elias Hausman's line about feeding the ground. Hide was protein, protein was nitrogen, and starving dirt wanted feeding. So she fed it. She spread the raw shavings thick around 40 young plants she had grown on the sill all winter, worked them in with her fingers, and watered the row twice. 4 days later, the row was dying. The leaves curled brown at the edges and hung down like wet paper. She pulled a plant, and the roots came up black and slick. She crushed a handful of the shavings, put it to her tongue, and tasted it. Salt. Under the salt, a chalky bite that dried her mouth. Lime. She sat back on her heels in the dirt and understood too late what she had done. The tannery softened its hides in lime and packed the scrap in salt to hold it, and she had laid both straight against tender roots. Salt pulled the water out of the plants. Lime burned what was left. The nitrogen she wanted was locked inside the collagen, and it would not come loose in 4 days. It would come loose over a season, and only after the salt and the lime were washed away. She wrote it on the blank page in 3 words. Wash it first. Then she counted the loss down the row, plant by dead plant, and the number stopped her cold. 40 seedlings, 1 whole winter of work, gone in 96 hours. A rain-soaked stretch of late summer, 2015, and Rachel Hausman stood in the open lean-to behind the barn, holding a belt she had cut and stitched from the coarse hide scrap. It had gone gray-green with mold, and so had the 20 others hung on the line beside it, and the banknote that came due each month would not wait on a line of ruined belts. 6 weeks of wet had done it. She smelled the sour bloom, ran her thumb across the fur of it, and carried the whole run to the burn pile. 2 months of evening work, thrown down. The next week she drove to the county extension office and traded a bushel of her early beans for an afternoon with Harold Kreider, a retired soil agent who still kept a test kit in his trunk. He scooped a jar of her compost, wet a strip, and read it. The carbon and the nitrogen were out of balance, he told her, the hide too rich, and a rich pile without enough dry brown matter to feed on turns to slime and stink instead of crumb. Layer in sawdust and straw, roughly 30 parts of that dry carbon to 1 of the hide, and let the rain run through it in a bin with a slatted floor so the salt and the lime leach down and away before spring. Then she found Vernon Byler, an old harness maker in Belleville who had shut his shop years back. She would oil and repair his fence rigs, and in return, he would teach her to cut and stitch so the goods would last. He set her hands on the round knife and showed her the stagger of a saddle stitch, why 1 loose thread rots a whole strap, why leather must cure dry before it ever hangs. She wrote both lessons on facing pages. Balance the pile. Cure the goods. But the tomatoes were still in the ground, feeding on the first rows she had layered right. Would the ground finally answer? An August morning in 2016, and Rachel Houseman walked the first bed with a bucket on her arm, picking tomatoes off vines that had climbed past her chin. The ground everyone had called finished carried more fruit than she could hold. She had layered the leached compost in the fall, 30 parts sawdust and straw to 1 of hide. Let the winter rain wash it through the slatted bin and work the crumb in during May. The collagen fed slow. It let go its nitrogen a little each week, the way Elias Houseman's ledger had promised, and the plants never once went yellow for want of it. Harold Kreider ran the numbers before she believed them herself. He weighed a single row and read the strip. "Your nitrogen is holding all season," he said, turning the jar in the light. "I have not seen this ground do this in 15 years. That Saturday, she loaded the flatbed for the Belleville market. A woman named Priscilla Zook, who ran the garden center out on Route 655, tasted 1 tomato at the stand and asked what she fed them. Rachel told her. Priscilla wanted the compost bagged, 40 bags to start, at $4 a bag. Beside the produce hung a rack of aprons and dog collars stamped with Rachel's own mark, cut from the coarse scrap, cured dry the way Vernon Byler had taught. They were gone by noon. A boy carried the last one to his mother across the gravel lot, the leather swinging bright against his knee. A late September afternoon in 2016, and Rachel Houseman was forking a fresh layer of straw over the compost bins when a white state car rolled up the lane and stopped at the barn. A man in a windbreaker got out with a clipboard and a camera. He walked the rows without asking, photographed the pile behind the barn, and handed her a folded order before he spoke a word. His name was Gerald Stutzman, Solid Waste Division. She read it standing in the stubble. Her rows were named an unpermitted industrial waste pile, land application of Tannery byproduct without a permit. She had 30 days to haul every pound of it away or face a daily fine. He told her plainly that a complaint had come in, and she knew from the careful way he would not name it whose it was. Across the road, the dairyman had watched her trailer come and go for 2 years. She said nothing. She wrote the date on the order and the number 30 beside it. That same week, a second blow landed. She drove to the Tannery on Cutler Corner for her Friday load and found a new sign over the door and a stranger at the desk. Curtis Yoder had sold the shop. The new owner had already signed the scrap over to a rendering company on a flat monthly fee, and he did not care that a woman with a trailer used to take it for free. The loading door where she had backed in every week was chained. 2 years of proof stood in her rows, and both ends were closing at once. The ground that fed her had 30 days to disappear, and the pile that built it was gone. That night she spread the soil tests across the kitchen table and started sorting them by date. 30 days later, on a bright morning in late October 2016, Gerald Stutzman came back to the Houseman farm to close it down. Rachel Houseman met him at the barn with a folder instead of a fight. She led him along the leached compost rows, knelt, and pressed a handful of dark crumb into his palm. No salt sting, no lime burn, only the smell of good soil. She handed him the chrome-free letter first. Curtis Yoder had signed it before the sale. The shop tanned with oak and hemlock bark, no chromium of any kind, so the shavings carried no metal that could load into the ground. Stutzman had seen chrome-tanned scrap before, the kind that stays poison in the earth for decades. This was the other thing. He turned the letter over twice. Then came Harold Kreider's soil sheets, 2 years of them, stacked by date. Nitrogen holding steady across a whole season, heavy metals below detection. The organic matter on the dead tomato ground had climbed from 2% to nearly 7%. "This is not a waste pile," Stutzman said at last, folding his clipboard shut. "This is a soil program." He walked the rows a second time on his own, slow, reading the tomato canes that had climbed past the wire.
Inside the workshop, he stopped at the rack of stamped aprons and the Belleville Garden Center order pinned to the wall. He did not write a fine. He wrote down what she would need to file for a beneficial use permit, and told her the salt and lime leaching was already the hardest part solved. The order to erase her rows turned into a permit she could earn. The first Saturday of November 2016, and the Belleville market lot filled before the tables were set. Word of the tomatoes on dead ground had traveled farmer to farmer all fall, and the line at Rachel Hausman's stand ran past 3 other stalls by 8 o'clock. She sold 40 bags of leached compost in under an hour, $4 each, and the stamped aprons and dog collars went off the rack faster than her hands could rehang them. Across the gravel, leaning on his tailgate, stood the dairyman who had filed the complaint. Marlin Stutzman had laughed at her trailer for 2 winters and called her the trash lady at the feed store, loud enough for the co-op counter to hear. Now he watched the line and said nothing. A stocky man in a canvas coat worked his way to the front and waited his turn like the rest. He was the new tannery owner from Cutler Corner, the one who had chained the loading door. He set a bag of compost down and put out his hand. "I ran the numbers on the rendering fee," Wendell Byler said. "You were hauling that scrap for nothing and turning it into this. I would rather sell it to you than pay a truck to take it off." Rachel wiped her hands on her apron and did not smile too quick. She named a price by the load, low, and he took it. The supply that had been cut off in September came back at a handshake over a folding table. Marlin Stutzman pushed off his tailgate and crossed the lot slow, stopping at the edge of her stand. He picked up 1 tomato, turned it in his fingers, and looked at the ground he had reported to the state. What was there left for him to say? A quiet evening in December 2016, and Rachel Hausman stood alone in her workshop with a wood stove ticking in the corner and the smell of oiled leather in the cold air. She hung the last apron on the rack, then reached up and set her stamp against the wall beam where the tannery scrap now hung in finished rows of belts and dog collars. Hausman ground, it read, cut into a strip of hide she had tanned and sewn herself. She pressed it into the wood and let it stay. Through the window she could see the 42 acres that once grew nothing worth picking. The dead tomato ground carried 7% organic matter now, up from 2%, and it had fed a heavy crop on nitrogen that leaked out of composted hide across a whole season. She opened Elias Hausman's ledger, the one Daniel's father had kept for 53 years, and wrote the winter numbers under his old hand. The bank letter that had once circled her was paid down to a line she could carry. She walked out to the barn where the same rusted flatbed trailer sat, the one she had backed up to the loading door on that first gray morning while the whole county watched and smelled and laughed. Tomorrow it would haul a load of scrap that a man now sold her by the ton. She ran her hand along the rail and left it there. The thing a tannery threw away for 11 years fed ground everyone had given up on. And it fed her. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments what you would have built from a pile nobody wanted. And tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe, and we will be back next week with another.